All right. Well, I hope this will give you a little bit of the inside story of the birth of the Piedmont, some of the trials and travails that we went through at the Department of Transportation to bring this train about. That would be the first Piedmonts, number 73 and 74. So where we are so far, of course, the Carolinian was operating, and Amtrak agreed to run that Raleigh-Charlotte train, but said that they did not have enough cars and locomotives to spare to run it. So North Carolina was going to have to ante up. I don't know whether they were trying to call our bluff or what, but another aspect, of course, was that those cars would be in effect isolated down here, and I don't think Amtrak wanted to have a little island operation like that. Norfolk Southern chimed in and required the state to construct a new turning facility at Charlotte for both the Carolinian and the new train. Those of you familiar with the Carolinian knew it used to run down the R line to Arrowwood Junction and turn on the Y there at night. But of course, the second train would need to be turned in the daytime, and Norfolk Southern wanted to reserve that time for its freight operation. And the Department of Transportation decided not to run the new train through Winston-Salem. Now, I'll be happy to return to all of these items because I think they're all worthy of discussion, but that's where we started. So, of course, we got to come up with some coaches, and buying new cars was out of the question due to the long lead time for construction. You're probably familiar with that, but it would have been years to construct new cars. So the state went shopping. And we went north to Alaska because the Alaska Railroad had bought some new coaches from Daewoo of Korea. That meant they had some surplus former Union Pacific cars to sell. And this is one of the UP cars, not bad, but impressed us as kind of utilitarian, not much style to them. And at the same time, the Chicago and Northwestern had cars for sale. Now, these were cars that were built for the Kansas City Southern. They went to New Jersey Transit and then were bought by Kansas City Southern. I'm sorry, bought by Chicago and Northwestern. The idea was they would be, some would be actually converted to sleepers, but they would be used on the Chicago and Northwestern's executive train. So when we got to Chicago, we found these rather handsome looking cars for sale and felt like we could probably do something nice with these cars. Of course, as you know, the cars have a seating section and then at the end, booth section for people that want to sit at a table.
Can I jump in here?
You may.
You mentioned that these were the last intercity passenger cars produced in the 1960s. When these cars were built, we really thought this was going to be the end. And the funny thing was and I didn't know about it because I was a freshman in high school or something, but there was a thing called the Trains Magazine Curse. I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
Sure.
The Trains Magazine Curse is that if Trains Magazine runs an article about something, there's a 50-50 chance it's going to be dead, soon. Well,
Yeah.
Trains had done a big article about the Kansas City Southern passenger train service. They have two trains a day. They have the Flying Crow and they have the Southern Belle. And they were both nice trains. The KCS, we spent a bunch of money on. Within a year of that article running, and they had these brand new cars and everything, they filed to abandon both trains.
Very good, Dutch, and correct. And since they were the last ones built by Pullman Standard, they had solved the so-called dissimilar metals problem. The early Pullman Standard cars started to rust from the inside, but these cars didn't have that problem. So another thing in their favor. And an interior shot, the cars pretty much as built for the Kansas City Southern. and unchanged by New Jersey Transit. And some were retained as coaches for use on the executive train for Chicago and Northwestern. So we like the looks of them. And we bought 5 of them. And here they are at their temporary home at the North Carolina Department of Transportation Equipment Depot on Barrel Road in Raleigh, right across the track from the state fairgrounds. So Alan, Paul, and I went to work, developed a general concept plan, a floor plan for how we wanted the coaches to look, and hired a consulting firm. And at that time, we couldn't afford to refurbish all 5 of them. So we put refurbishment of 4 cars out to bid. And the winning bidder was Delaware Car Company in Wilmington, Delaware. If you ride Amtrak now in the Northeast Corridor, right after your northbound train leaves the Wilmington, Delaware station, if you look on the left, down at street level, you'll see Delaware Car Company.
Camel and I rode that 2 weeks ago. The Metroliner shells that were there for a long time are gone now.
Oh, they're gone.
Yeah, you can't really tell where it was. Looks like there's one inside the shed, but they're not sitting out there anymore.
Wonder if they found a buyer or if they scrapped them.
Oh, good question.
Yeah. Part of the consulting firm's work, of course, was to give us some options for what we wanted. We looked at various kinds of seats. In the end, we bought the seats that were bought for the Reno Fun Train, which never came to fruition. Regular Amtrak seats, but as you know, the cushions are different. Alan, Paul, and I decided we could do a better job. But one thing about the reclining seats, the bottom seat cushion doesn't move when you recline. The seats they were replacing, as the seats reclined, that bottom cushion moved forward, so it was more comfortable. But we decided we would go with the Amtrak seats with a revised cushion. And the consulting firm got to work with some large sheets of foam board and mocked up various parts of the cars, including the restroom. So this was an early study of how the restroom on the Piedmont coaches might look. Meanwhile, back in Raleigh, there's an outfit called Correction Enterprises. This is a group, part of the correction system. Men and maybe women too, but in our case, men from a minimum security prison can go to work outside the prison walls for a day. They're paid $1 a day. They work under the supervision of a hired foreman. And so we hired them to remove the seats from the cars to save some money. And so I got the crew started, and here these inmates at work under the foreman's supervision, and they had the tools necessary to get the seats. Of course, they had to partially rotate them, and then with wrenches and extensions, they could take the bolts out of the floor. And as you might imagine, there was not a lot of enthusiasm for the work, because the longer the job lasted, the longer these men were out of prison. So they enjoyed that. So I left the job behind thinking to myself, well, this is going to be a few days work, but that's all right. At $1 a day per man, we could stand that. Well, I went back that afternoon and I was amazed how much progress had been made. So I got the foreman off to the side and I said, I got to admit, I am surprised how rapidly this crew went to work. And he said, well, they started off slow, but as they started disassembling the seats, they began to find loose change that had fallen back behind the seats from their days on New Jersey Transit. And I told them they could keep whatever they found. So they got a bonus they were flipping these seats like mad in hopes that they'd find some quarters. And with a base pay of $1 a day, they very quickly surpassed that. So they did a nice job getting those seats out of there. We could not, we actually put the seats up for sale in case there was some tourist operation that wanted them, but had no takers. So ended up having to scrap the seats. And with the seats out, we finally got the cars ready to leave Raleigh. And I went to work and handmade some stencils. And I actually made up a reporting mark, NCDT. That didn't exist, but I got away with it. And you'll see that the number of 400-0001, well, the Department of Transportation, every piece of equipment first is in a 3-digit equipment code, motor graders, dump trucks, and so on. And so I was talking to the people who assign such things, and the first code they gave me was 666. And I said, I don't believe that's going to make it with, biblically, that could create some concerns. So they said, well, what do you want? And I thought, well, since we bought from the Chicago and Northwestern, and the Chicago and Northwestern had several fine streamlined passenger trains called the 400s, as you probably well know, I asked if 400 was available. They said, yes, it was. So actually, when you see the car numbers, you'll see they begin with 400, and that's where it comes from. Those cars are North Carolina Department of Transportation class code 400.
North Carolina grabbed the route of the 400.
There's not many people that know that, Dutch. I didn't tell them, but they gave me 400. So there's the 400 0001, still in New Jersey Transit paint. And of course, as you probably know, CSX serves Raleigh with freight service and also serves Wilmington, Delaware with freight service. So we build the cars to Wilmington, Delaware. And we lined up the train master at Wilmington, Delaware, said, now we've got these cars coming, and they go to Wilmington, Delaware Car Company there. And the first hint I had of trouble was when I got a call from Delaware Car Company saying, well, where are the cars? And sure enough, they were not in Wilmington, Delaware. Oh, started doing a little investigating. And of course, having been a train master, I said, well, where the heck was the train master? He was supposed to be on the lookout for these cars. Now, the catch was, being passenger cars, CSX handled them on the rear of the train so as to avoid damage. Well, it turned out the night they passed through Wilmington, there'd been a derailment in Philadelphia. So the train master was over in Philadelphia in the wee hours of the morning when the train passed through, and the crew, for some reason, did not set the cars out. Well, here's where being a rail fan kind of comes in handy, because I knew what train number they were on. I knew what train number they had departed Hamlet on, and it was the Conrail run-through. This was a train that terminated at Binghamton, New York on Conrail. So also using some Railfan network information, I got the telephone number of the yard clerk in Binghamton, New York. Called him up, told him what I suspected had happened, that there might be some extra cars in his yard, described them, gave him the numbers. He said, well, let me call you back. I'll go up. He called me back about 30 minutes later, and he said, yep, they're up here, all 5 of them. So my next phone call was to CSX, telling them where the cars were. and telling them we need them back in Wilmington, Delaware as fast as they can. Well, the next thing that went wrong was it turns out Conrail had a practice, they did not handle passenger cars except on special trains. So they told CSX that, no, we're not hanging them on a freight train to go back to Wilmington. You're going to have to pay us for a special train to take them back from Binghamton. I got a call from CSX explaining all this. I said, I'll tell you something, the state is not paying for a special train. You messed it up, you get them back. So to this day, I don't know if CSX paid for a special train or if they got Conrail to violate its own practices. But about 10 days later, the cars showed up back in Wilmington. And Delaware Car Company went to work on them, starting to strip the paint, taking the diaphragms off. And of course, here's the inside, nice and clean, getting ready for Delaware Car to go to work. And part of the work included changing some windows. So you'll see in this part of that large window is blanked out. But lo and behold, we finally got the job done. And probably everybody in this room is familiar with the coaches on the Piedmont. And we're certainly proud of them. Delaware Car is proud of them. And here's the exterior. Now, at the time, Amtrak, even though North Carolina had to provide the cars, said, oh, they'll have to look like Amtrak cars. So this was the Amtrak scheme at the time. Of course, we put the state flag at the end of the cars instead of North Carolina state flag, of course, instead of the Amtrak arrow that their cars carried. And I don't know, Dutch, you may know if you work at night, we had the lights installed so that when the trap door of the vestibule raises, the ground light comes on. I don't know if that's still operable.
I work at night. So
okay.
Yeah, but that's something I you know, occasionally I will have to fill in for someone. So I'll keep an eye out for that.
Yeah. That was, of course, an idea we got from the Chesapeake and Ohio when they had their cars built by Pullman Standard. They had ground lights so people could see where they were stepping. All right, locomotives got to have something to pull these coaches with. And the Maryland Area Rail Commuter, MARC, was a big help here, providing specifications for their locomotives, which they call GP40H-2s. And the former Canadian National Maintenance Facility in Montreal, which was spun off as Atelier Montréal Facilité, AMF, was very hungry for the work. So they put in a bid of $925,000 per locomotive, which was a bargain in those days. So we lucked out very much. So AMF went to work building rebuilding two locomotives for us. And this is in the shop in pieces. There's a locomotive cab. And then at the long hood end, of course, they had to extend it to put a Cummins diesel in there to provide the head end power for the coaches. And finally, the finished product. And what started out as Louisville and Nashville 3006 and Baltimore and Ohio 4008 became our city of Charlotte and city of Raleigh. And of course, you notice we made the color scheme look something like the state flag, but we thought the front looked a little too dark. So for grade crossing safety, we enlarged the star from the North Carolina state flag. So that's why the star was oversized, if you remember those locomotives. So it may look more like the state of Texas state flag, which has a larger star. And of course, I had the locomotives geared for a maximum speed of 117 miles an hour. And you can't go over 79 in the United States without a supplemental signal system, which we did not have in these locomotives, but the rules in Canada are different. So the manufacturer assured me that they had tried them out. And if we wanted to run 100 miles an hour, these babies would do it. All right, well, on to the turning facility down in Charlotte. And apologize if you can't quite see, but this down at the bottom is the Atlanta-Washington main line. And then the line going up is the line to Mooresville. And up at a place called Otando Junction, a few blocks up from the switch off the Atlanta-Washington main line, they proposed building a track to make a Y. One leg of the Y could be added there. But that red block happens to be a house. So a house would have to be purchased and torn down to make this work.
Bob, if I could just, for those of you who may not be familiar with the concept of a Y, imagine your train starting at the bottom of the screen there on the left-hand side. It makes that left turn, it goes up, it then kind of curves around, and it goes on to that Mooresville line Bob was talking about. So now the train's facing towards Mooresville. What they do then is they back it up, past the first switch, past the second one, and then run it forward and go back the way they came, and the train's reversed. That's why they call that a Y at the end there.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Dutch, except we do it the other way. They take the first leg, the left leg first.
Okay, all right.
And then back towards Mooresville. All right, because of that impediment of having a house in the way, we went to work, and this is typical houses in the neighborhood, not much to them. But I had my engineer go to work looking for other places to turn the train down. We even considered the possibility of a loop track down south of downtown, or uptown Charlotte, as they call it, and where the maintenance facility will one day be built. But eventually decided that the best way to go was indeed Norfolk Southern's possibility or proposal. So the house was appraised at $30,000, and I authorized Norfolk Southern to offer $60,000 for the house. And we needed that house torn down, out of the way in a hurry. But the state's offer was rejected. It turns out that the house was only used 1 or 2 days a week by a church group for prayer services. And there was an attorney in the prayer group, and he convinced the rest of his members that he could get even more money for it. So, yeah, the offer was turned down. All right, more time had to elapse because we had to go to condemnation. That takes quite a while. Finally, the judge ruled that the house could indeed be condemned and torn down, and awarded the church group $50,000. So everybody lost in this deal. The state lost almost 3 months of time. The church group lost $10,000. However, finally we got to work constructing that new leg of the Y. This is where the house used to stand. And this is putting in the track panel across Graham Street in Charlotte. And finally, Amtrak's office car showed up in Raleigh for a special occasion, which was the inauguration of the Piedmont, May 25th, 1995. Here she is breaking the banner on the inaugural run, which of course was for invited guests only, and regular service began from Charlotte the next day. So that's the Piedmont story.